When the cab pulled up to the address on Fort Street, the driver didn't put it in park. He left the engine running and sat very still, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the building in front of us. I leaned forward from the back seat. "Is something wrong?" He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his face that I couldn't immediately name. Not fear exactly. More like the expression a person wears when they already know the ending of a story and they're trying to decide whether to tell you. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need you to stay in this car for a few minutes. I know that sounds strange coming from someone you just met, but I need you to trust me. Don't go inside yet." I almost laughed. I'd been taking cabs and rideshares in Victoria for 30 years, and not once had a driver ever told me to stay in the vehicle. I was 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and perfectly capable of walking into a law office on my own. But something about his tone stopped me. He wasn't nervous. He was calm in the way that experienced people are calm, the deliberate stillness of someone who has been in difficult situations before and knows that panic helps no one. "My daughter arranged this appointment," I said. "It's just some estate paperwork." "Routine," she told me. He met my eyes in the rearview mirror. "What's your daughter's name?" I told him. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected. "And her husband?" he asked. "Is his name Brett?" The back of my neck went cold. "How do you know that?" He reached into the pocket of his jacket and showed me a card. It was old, worn at the edges, but the crest on it was unmistakable. Royal Canadian Mounted Police. His name was Michael Tran. Below the crest it said Financial Crimes Unit. "I'm retired now," he said. 3 years. But I still drive part-time. Keep myself busy. He glanced back at the building. "I also consult, informally, with a colleague who's still active. And that address, the firm your daughter sent you to, it's been on my colleague's radar for about 4 months. I felt the air leave the car. Let me back up, because I know this is the kind of story that sounds impossible until you're sitting inside it. Until you're the one in the back of a cab on a Tuesday afternoon watching everything you thought you knew rearrange itself into a shape you don't recognize. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I taught grade 5 at Willows Elementary in Victoria for 31 years, and I loved every one of those years. My husband, Gerald, was a civil engineer with the city. We had 2 children, our daughter Sophie and our son Daniel, who lives with his family in Halifax. We had a house on Fern Street in Oak Bay that we bought in 1989 for $220,000, and that is now, according to the last assessment notice that came in the mail, worth just under $1.4 million. Gerald died of a heart attack 26 months ago. He was 69, healthy by all appearances, and then one morning he was simply gone. I won't try to describe that loss here because I don't think language can hold it. I'll only say that it left me in a silence so complete that I could hear it. Sophie and her husband Brett stepped in almost immediately. That should have been a comfort, and for a while it was. Sophie had always been the more present of my 2 children, geographically at least. Daniel calls every Sunday and visits at Christmas, and loves me in the steady, undramatic way of people who are simply good. But Sophie was close, 20 minutes away in Sonic, and she began appearing at my door with casseroles, with offers to drive me to appointments, with suggestions that we sort through Gerald's things together. She had power of attorney drawn up 3 months after Gerald died. It was her idea, presented over tea at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in February. "Mom," she said, "we just want to make sure everything is protected. You have a lot of assets. The house, Dad's pension, the investments. You shouldn't have to manage all of that alone. Brett has a financial background. Let us help." I signed it. Of course I signed it, she was my daughter. What I didn't notice, because grief is a kind of fog that softens edges and blurs details, was that Brett had started making small comments about the house, how much work it needed, how the market was strong right now, historically strong, how a lot of people my age were finding it made more financial sense to downsize, to free up equity, to simplify. I thought he was making conversation. I didn't understand that he was preparing an argument. I also didn't notice, because Sophie managed my online banking login by then, that over the following 14 months, money had been moving. Not in large dramatic transfers, that would have been obvious, but in small, careful amounts, $2,000 here, $3,500 there, occasional larger ones described as home maintenance or estate management fees. My financial advisor, a man named Gerald had used for years, who retired and handed his clients to a younger colleague, had sent a letter flagging some unusual activity. I never saw that letter. Sophie collected my mail twice a week to help me stay organized. The appointment that Tuesday was described to me as a review of my estate plan. Sophie had called the Friday before, apologetic and warm. "Mom, I'm so sorry I can't come with you. I have that thing with the school board that I absolutely cannot reschedule. But I've set everything up. It's the firm on Fort Street. Just go in and sign the updated documents. It's all been explained to us already. It's just a formality. Standard stuff." I'd asked what I was signing. Exactly. She'd said it was a codicil to my existing will, some property transfer documentation to streamline probate, nothing complicated. Brett had reviewed everything, she said. It was all in order. My car was in the shop that week, some issue with the brake pads, so I called a cab. Michael Tran got my ride request. He'd been watching the firm on Fort Street for his former colleague for 2 months by then, flagging any activity that seemed relevant. When he saw the destination come through on his app, he told me later he almost called it in immediately, but he decided it was better to see who he was picking up first, to understand the full picture before he did anything that couldn't be undone. He picked me up at my house on Fern Street. He told me afterward that when he saw me, 67, alone, carrying a folder of documents, he felt something settle in his chest. He'd seen this before. He knew exactly what was happening. But he also knew that if he called it in immediately and was wrong, if this was just a legitimate estate appointment, he'd have caused a scene, frightened an elderly woman, and possibly interfered in nothing. So he drove. He asked careful questions, the way he'd been trained to do, building a picture without revealing that he was building anything. By the time we pulled up to Fort Street, he had enough. He told me about the firm, that it had been flagged in connection with 3 other cases of elder financial exploitation in the previous 18 months, that it specialized in what investigators called paper transfers, transactions that looked legitimate on the surface, but were structured to move assets out of the names of vulnerable seniors and into secondary accounts or corporate shells before anyone thought to look. He told me about the documents I'd been sent to sign. His colleague had obtained a copy through a related investigation. What I was going to walk in and sign was not a codicil to my will. It was a transfer of beneficial ownership of my home on Fern Street into a numbered company registered in Brett's name. There was a second document, a reverse mortgage authorization, that would borrow against the equity in the house immediately upon transfer. The combined effect would have been to strip the property entirely within 60 days. Once those documents were registered with the Land Title Office, reversing them would take years and a great deal of money. If it was possible at all. I sat in the back of that cab and I looked at the folder in my lap. The folder Sophie had couriered to my house the week before with a sticky note that said, "Just your copies, everything's ready, love you, Mom." "How much?" I asked Michael. "How much has already been moved?" He said his colleague's estimate was approximately $280,000 over 14 months. From Gerald's pension survivor benefit, from the investment account, from a line of credit that had been opened in my name without my knowledge. $280,000. Gerald had worked for the city of Victoria for 34 years. He'd been careful with money his whole adult life, careful in the patient, unglamorous way of people who grew up without much of it. He'd packed his lunch. He'd driven the same truck for 11 years. He'd put money into the RRSP every single year, even the years when things were tight. Even the year Sophie was born and Daniel started university. That money was supposed to be mine. It was supposed to last me the rest of my life. I think I said something like, "That can't be right." And Michael said, very quietly, "I know it doesn't feel possible, but I think you knew something was wrong before today. I think that's why it hurts the way it's hurting right now, and not just because it's a surprise." He was right, and I hated that he was right. There had been moments, small ones, individually explainable. The way Brett would redirect the conversation whenever I asked specific questions about my accounts. The way Sophie had gently, kindly suggested that maybe I shouldn't worry about the financial details, that it was stressful and I'd been through so much. The way she described my old financial advisor's concern letter as a computer error, a glitch in the new system, nothing to worry about. I had explained every single one of those moments away. Because she was my daughter. Because I was lonely. Because grief makes you want to believe that the people who show up for you are showing up out of love and not out of calculation. What happens now? I asked. Michael had already made a call while I sat in the back seat processing what he'd told me. His former colleague, a woman named Staff Sergeant Diane Kowalski with the RCMP's Commercial Crime Section in Victoria, was on her way. So was a representative from BC's Public Guardian and Trustee Office, who had the authority to place a hold on my accounts and put an emergency protective measure over the property title. "They're going to meet us down the street," he said. "Away from the building. We don't want to spook anyone inside." "I want to know something first," I said. "Before anyone else gets here. I want to know how you ended up driving a cab in Victoria 3 years after retiring from the RCMP." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother came here from Vietnam in 1979. She worked in a fish processing plant in Prince Rupert for 8 years, saved every dollar she could, moved to Victoria, opened a small alterations shop on Cook Street. She ran that shop for 25 years. When she was 64 and starting to slow down, her landlord sold the building, and the new owner offered to help her relocate the business. He was very kind, very helpful. He found her a new space, drew up the lease, explained everything to her. Her English had always been imperfect, and he knew that. The lease he had her sign had a clause in it that allowed him to seize her equipment and inventory if she missed a single payment, even by 1 day. 14 months later, she missed a payment by 3 days because of a banking error. He showed up with a moving truck. She lost everything. I didn't say anything. "I was working a case in Edmonton when it happened," he continued. "By the time I flew home, it was done. I spent 2 years trying to find a legal remedy, and there wasn't one. The lease was legitimate. What he did was predatory and wrong and completely legal. My mother went to work at a grocery store at 66 years old. She died 4 years later. She never got any of it back." I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "And that's why you do this. Someone has to know what to look for," he said simply, "and I know what to look for." Staff Sergeant Kowalski arrived 12 minutes later in a plain sedan. She was in her early 50s, with very short red hair and the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades not wasting words. She sat in the front passenger seat of Michael's cab and introduced herself and explained what was about to happen in the kind of clear, practical language that was exactly what I needed. The property transfer hold would be filed that afternoon, she said. It would prevent any documents related to my property from being registered at the Land Title Office for 30 days, giving her team time to complete the investigation and obtain a formal court order if needed. The account freeze had already been initiated through BC's Public Guardian and Trustee Office, triggered by Michael's call. My accounts were being protected from further movement as of approximately 4 minutes ago. As for Sophie and Brett, she said, they would be contacted today. An RCMP officer would attend their home in Saanich. I thought of Sophie being told. I thought of her face. "Is she?" I started. "Is my daughter? I mean, is it her? Or is it him? Is it both of them?" Kowalski looked at me with an expression that was kind and direct at the same time. "In cases like this," she said, "it's rarely simple. We'll know more after we've talked to them. But based on the documentation we have, both names appear in the transactions." I looked out the window at the building on Fort Street. A man in a gray suit was coming out the front door now, checking his phone, walking toward a parked car without looking up. He had no idea that 20 meters away, in the back of an ordinary cab, the plan he'd helped construct was being dismantled. I gave my statement at the RCMP detachment on Caledonia Avenue. Michael drove me there and came inside, and he stayed for most of the afternoon, even though no one had asked him to, and his shift was technically over. Kowalski brought me a coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning, and I drank all of it. The statement took 2 hours. I described everything I could remember, every conversation about finances, every document I'd signed, every moment I'd noticed something and talked myself out of it. Kowalski's colleague, a young constable named Park, typed everything I said with a patience and attentiveness that made me feel, for the first time since I'd been sitting in that cab, like what had happened to me mattered. Like I wasn't just an elderly woman who'd been careless. I called Daniel from a small room down the hall while Kowalski was consulting with someone from the Public Guardian's office. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when he heard my voice he said immediately, "Mom, what's wrong?" I told him. The way I told him wasn't elegant or composed. I sat in a chair in a small beige room at the RCMP detachment, and I cried through most of it, and Daniel didn't try to stop me or fix anything or rush to the end of the story. He just said, "I'm here, Mom," and kept saying it at intervals, the way you hold a door open so someone knows they can still walk through. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm booking a flight tonight. Don't sign anything. Don't go home alone. I'll be there by tomorrow morning." I told him he didn't have to come. He said, "Mom, you've been there for every single thing that ever happened to me. Please let me come." I said okay. They drove me to a hotel that evening, a Quality Inn on Douglas Street, because my house on Fern Street was now technically part of an active investigation and would need to be assessed by a financial crimes analyst before I could return. Kowalski explained that there would be records, physical documents, possibly devices, that her team needed to document in situ. She said 48 hours at most, and then it would be released back to me. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed that night, and I tried to think about Sophie. I tried to understand it, to find the sequence of decisions that leads from a girl I raised, a girl I taught to read in the living room of that house on Fern Street on Saturday mornings before her brother was even awake, to a woman who looked at her mother's grief and saw an opportunity. I couldn't find the sequence. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some betrayals don't have a clean explanation that would make them easier to hold. My phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. "Mom, there's been a huge misunderstanding. Please call me." Then another. "Mom, Brett had no idea this would be a problem. The lawyer told us it was all legal." Then another, 20 minutes later. "Mom, you have to understand. We've been covering your expenses for 2 years. We needed to protect ourselves too." I turned the phone over and put it face down on the nightstand. Daniel arrived at 7:40 in the morning, pulling a small suitcase, still wearing the jacket he'd worn on the plane. He sat beside me on the hotel bed and put his arm around me without saying anything, and we sat there for a while just like that, looking at the pale morning light coming through the curtains. Eventually he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you been okay? Before all this, were you doing all right on your own?" I thought about it. I had been managing. I had my routines, my book club on Thursday evenings, my walks along the waterfront in the mornings, my Sunday calls with Daniel and the boys. But lonely, I said. I was lonely. And Sophie was there. She kept showing up. He nodded. "I should have been there more. You have your family," I said. "You have your life. I didn't want you to feel like you had to." He shook his head. "Mom, you are my family. You and those boys playing soccer in the backyard, those are not separate categories." I thought about that. About how the loneliness had made me easy to reach. About how grief can make you so hungry for care that you stop asking whether the person offering it has their hand in your pocket. Michael Tran came by the hotel that afternoon. He brought a container of his mother's recipe pho from a restaurant on Pandora Street that his cousin owned, and the three of us sat around the small hotel table and ate soup, while Michael carefully explained the legal process ahead in plain language, translating between the official terminology and what it would actually mean for my daily life. The proceeds of crime section of the RCMP would work with the public guardian and trustee to recover funds that had been moved, he said. The land title office hold meant my property was secure. In terms of criminal charges, the Crown would decide on the specifics, but he said the most likely path involved charges under the Criminal Code of Canada for fraud over $5,000 and criminal breach of trust. Both carried significant penalties. "What about the law firm?" Daniel asked. Michael said his colleague was pursuing that angle separately. The lawyer involved was known to facilitate transactions for clients who asked questions he shouldn't have been willing to answer. That was a matter for the Law Society of British Columbia, as well as the Crown. I asked Michael how long he'd been watching the Fort Street firm. 8 weeks, he said. Your daughter and Brett had been in contact with them for longer than that. The transactions in your accounts started about 4 months before we identified the firm. I did the arithmetic. That meant they'd started laying the groundwork approximately 7 months after Gerald died, before the year of mourning was even finished. I said that out loud. 7 months. Michael looked at his soup. Some people move faster, he said. Some slower. The time frame doesn't really change what it is. No, I said. It doesn't. Here's what the following 8 months looked like. I moved back into my house on Fern Street as soon as it was released. I changed the locks, which I'd been told to do, and which felt both necessary and like an act of violence against a version of my life I was still grieving. I revoked the power of attorney immediately through a lawyer Daniel found who specialized in elder law. I opened new accounts at a different institution, and I sat with the new financial advisor for 3 full sessions until I understood, clearly and without anyone else's mediation, exactly what I had and exactly where it was. I learned things in those sessions that I should have learned years earlier, not because anyone had kept them from me, but because I'd been so accustomed to Gerald managing the financial details that I'd never thought to learn them myself. I learned how to read an investment statement. I learned what a registered account was and how it was protected. I learned what questions to ask and which answers were incomplete. By the 4th session, I was asking questions the advisor seemed genuinely surprised to receive. I also learned that approximately $214,000 of the missing $280,000 was recoverable. It had been traced to accounts in Brett's name and a numbered corporation he'd registered. The remaining $66,000 had been spent, largely on renovations to their house in Sonic and what the forensic accountant described as lifestyle expenses. The trial took 11 months. I won't walk through every day of it because some of it was technical and some of it was painful in ways that don't translate well into narrative. I'll say only the parts that matter. I sat in that courtroom and I watched my daughter. I watched her throughout the testimony from Kowalski's team, through the forensic accountant's careful walking of the jury through every transfer, every authorization, every document bearing my signature that had been presented to me in a context designed to obscure what I was actually agreeing to. Sophie sat very still. She looked at the table in front of her more than she looked at me. Brett sat beside her with the expression of a man who was still, even now, calculating whether there was an angle he'd missed. The hardest single moment was an email that was entered into evidence. It was from Brett to Sophie, dated 11 days after Gerald's funeral. It said, "Insurance pays out in 90 days. Once that clears into her account, we move it. She won't check for months. She's a mess. Start with the advisor relationship. Get her comfortable with us handling it. She's a mess." That was his description of me. That was how he saw the woman whose husband had just died, whose daughter he was married to, whose home had been full of holidays and birthday parties, and the ordinary sustaining texture of a family life. Sophie was convicted on 3 counts, including fraud over $5,000 and conspiracy to commit a fraud. Brett on 4 counts, including criminal breach of trust. Sophie received a sentence of 4 years less a day. Brett received 5.5 years. The Crown sought restitution as well, and the court ordered the maximum recoverable amount returned to me within 2 years. I felt no triumph in the courtroom when the verdicts came. Daniel held my hand, and I looked at my daughter, and I felt something that I cannot describe as anything simpler than sorrow. Sorrow for what she did. Sorrow for what she was willing to do. Sorrow for the mother I'd tried to be, and the daughter that had not been enough to produce. But I also felt something else, a kind of clarity that I'd been missing for 2 years, maybe longer. The fog that grief had put over everything was still there, but underneath it something had hardened into a shape I could rely on. I knew who I was. I knew what I had. I knew what I was worth. Not in dollars, in the sense of what my life had been and still was. I began volunteering with BC's Seniors First Society 6 weeks after the verdict. It's an organization that provides legal information and advocacy for older British Columbians, and they have a program specifically focused on financial abuse awareness. I went to my first meeting expecting to sit quietly in the back and maybe hand out pamphlets. And I ended up speaking for 40 minutes because a woman in the second row had described a situation with her son that sounded so familiar, I couldn't not say something. She called me afterward. We met for coffee. 3 months later, she had revoked an unauthorized power of attorney and recovered approximately $90,000. She sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of her grandchildren on the front. Michael and I have kept in touch. We have dinner every few weeks at his cousin's restaurant on Pandora Street, sometimes with Daniel when he's in town, sometimes with Kowalski, who has become something close to a friend, despite the fact that we met in the back of a cab on the worst afternoon of my life. Michael's mother's soup is always on the menu. I always order it. One evening in early spring, sitting at our usual table near the window with the cherry blossoms just starting outside, Michael said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "You know what my training taught me, more than anything else? That the most effective frauds are the ones that disguise themselves as love. Because love is the thing people most want to be real. So when someone offers you something that looks like love and asks for almost nothing in return, or asks gradually, in small amounts, the instinct is to believe it. Not because you're naive, because you're human." I looked at him. I asked, "Did you believe it with your mother? With the landlord who helped her?" He nodded. I thought he was a good man. She thought he was a good man. We both wanted that to be true. "I know the feeling," I said. "But here's what I've learned since then," he said. "The wanting to believe isn't the mistake. It's what makes you a person. The mistake is forgetting that love doesn't ask you to stop paying attention. Real love, the kind that actually protects you, doesn't ask you to hand over your account passwords or sign documents you haven't read or trust that everything is fine because someone who loves you says so. Real love holds up the light so you can see clearly. It doesn't dim it so you can't." I think about that on the mornings when I do my own banking now, sitting at my own kitchen table with my reading glasses on, going through my own statements line by line. I think about it when I talk to the women at Seniors First who are still in the middle of it, still hoping the version of their son or daughter or niece that they believed in might somehow be recoverable. I don't tell them it isn't. I tell them to look at the facts, all of them, and to trust what they see. Daniel and his family came for 2 weeks last summer. His youngest, Marcus, turned 9 while they were here, and we had a birthday party in the backyard, the same backyard where Sophie used to do cartwheels on summer evenings, where Gerald built a small deck that still needs a new board on the left side and which I will get around to fixing eventually. The children ran around until the light went low and golden and the mosquitoes got too aggressive, and Daniel and I sat in the Muskoka chairs he'd brought from the shed and drank iced tea and watched them. He asked me how I was doing, really. I told him the truth. I said that I missed Gerald every single day and that I expected I always would. I said that I had stopped missing the version of Sophie I'd believed existed, and that the missing of the version that did exist was different, quieter, something I was still learning to live alongside. I said that my life was good, that I was genuinely, not performatively, not bravely, but genuinely all right. He said he was glad. I said, "I want you to know that I don't need you to worry about me anymore. I'm not saying that to let you off the hook or to be stoic. I'm saying it because it's true. I know my finances. I know my rights. I know who's in my corner. I'm a harder target than I used to be, and I'm not embarrassed to say so." He laughed a little. "You were never a soft target, Mom. They just caught you at the wrong time." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm at the right time now." The grandchildren came running back to the deck wanting lemonade, and Daniel got up to get it, and I stayed where I was, in the wooden chair on the deck Gerald built, on a warm evening in Victoria, in the backyard of the house I had lived in for 35 years, and owned free and clear, and would not be signing away to anyone. I was 68 years old. I knew my balance to the penny. I had a son who called every Sunday and came when it mattered. I had new friends who had found each other in the worst circumstances and just elope and to keep each other anyway. I had work that made a difference to people who needed it. I had a deck that needed one new board. That is not a small life. That is not a life that was taken from me. I want to ask you something before we finish. What city are you listening from today? And if any part of this story sounds familiar, if something in your own life is making you uneasy and you can't quite name why, please trust that unease. Look at your accounts. Ask for the documents in plain language. Call someone you trust who is not the person managing your money. The information you need to protect yourself is available to you. You are allowed to ask for it. You are allowed to ask more than once. And if someone you love is asking you to stop paying attention, that is not love. That is something else. You deserve to know the difference.